All right, so I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'm Ranjan Adiga, by the way. I teach in the LMW program. I also have been curating our poetry reading series since last year, and I'm so happy to be part of this. With the help of an endowment, the Anne Newman Sutton Weeks Poetry Series invites poets and prose writers to Westminster every year for an evening of literary reading and conversations about matters that are urgent, important, surprising, and sometimes controversial. Though some readers may find our first guest of this academic year controversial, there is no doubt about the urgency and beauty in her writing. In her book, Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex, Angela Chen carefully dispels the myth that to be asexual is to be old, dried up, and boring. In fact, the ACE orientation is as dynamic and varied as any other. It provides us, quote, new ways to talk about attraction, new ways to think about attraction, to more clearly evaluate a bond. Chosen as one of the best books of 2020 by NPR and widely reviewed by the New York Times, Washington Post, among others, Ace is a book that combines memoir with research, reportage, and criticism, never heavy-handed, always lucid and insightful, intellectual and vulnerable. I was moved by the beautiful sentences and introduced to other types of intimacies that I too may have experienced but lacked the language to understand until I read the book. A senior editor at Wired, Chen's work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Geographic, among others. I'm so glad and honored to invite Angela Chen to Westminster. Friends, students, and colleagues, please give a round of applause for our guest, Angela Chen.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here. As I look at the audience, I keep thinking that whenever I'm in the audience and the presenter or announcer says something like, "There's plenty of room up here, please move up," I never do it. But as I'm looking at you, I deeply feel the desire to say that. And I want you to know that I'm not saying it, but I'm thinking it. And in the end, we all become what we fear. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. When I heard that this was going to be a reading, part of me assumed, maybe I should read from my book, but I personally never like it when I go to a reading, and I've already read the book, and I don't get much more out of the narrating. So I wanted to give a version of a talk that I've been working on, and it's about asexuality and the future of sexual politics. And I should say that this is not an ACE 101 talk. About a year after my book came out, I promised myself I would never do an ACE 101 talk again. And I'm not going to define the terms. And if you don't know much about asexuality, I have a book I could recommend. So with that, I want to start by talking about epistemic authority, because in the course of my reading and my reporting and just my lived experience, I think that one of the keys to understanding the obstacles that ACEs face today, and the prerequisite for understanding so much else, is how much asexuality reveals the hypocrisy in the ways that we talk about ourselves and our lived experience. And when I say we, I mean progressives and I mean feminists, and these are the people that I criticize because these are the people that I consider to be my own groups. So today among these groups, there's this ideal that people get to be the authority on themselves. If you are trans people are the authority on trans people, disabled people are the authority on disabled people, so on and so forth. This doesn't always happen in practice, but among people on the left, there is the agreement that this is the ideal. But ACE people are very rarely allowed to be the authority on our own asexuality, or even our own experience for those who have had the experience we would call ACE, but have not yet found the label. So I keep thinking about an interview that I did for an article about sex therapy that I wrote for The Atlantic. And this interview didn't make it into the final cut, but I think about it a lot because I think it's a really, really poignant story. And for this interview, I talked to a person named Jessie, who went to therapy because they and their husband were having sexual issues, essentially around their amount of sexual desire. And they specifically went to a therapist that advertised themselves as doing offbeat therapy, which means kink, poly, and essentially other types of queerness. And this person had never heard of asexuality. Jessie also didn't know about asexuality, but when they talked about their experiences, the immediate response was, oh, this is very common. Here are some exercises you want to do. I know what's best for you. So I'm going to read some of the quotes here because they're direct quotes and I don't want to get them wrong. Jessie's words. I was finding that every time I felt like I needed to do some of our counseling homework, I would get super anxious about it because all of a sudden, it felt like there were all these expectations on how things were supposed to go. If I just did them right, we could get to this point, but I really didn't want to get to the thing at the end. I didn't want to get to sex. So that all kind of snowballed and made me withdraw further and further and further, and it messed with my head. It made me feel like I was failing therapy. Jessie didn't want to do these exercises, and they ended up saying that they felt like there was so much stress and so much pressure to do them that it was never truly consensual. They said it was something they didn't want, but, quote, I was deferring to the therapist as an authority figure. So as I said, at the time, Jessie didn't realize they were ace, and they didn't realize this until they had left the relationship and the therapist. But I think about it a lot because it seems like such a perfect example of how people who call themselves progressive do not see their own double standards regarding the respect that should be afforded to others who speak of their experiences. I'm not trying to call out this specific therapist, but I am thinking about them as a metaphor for so many progressive folks or queer spaces that don't make room for asexuality. And it's angering because despite the progressive fixation correctly on lived experience, that when Jessie told this person about their experience and what wasn't working, this therapist was so wedded to this idea of what a person should be like sexually that she didn't listen to what her client was actually saying. There's just so many stories, they're in the book, but they're ones that people have told me in the years since the book was published, which is 3 years ago tomorrow, about how the same people who talk about decentering themselves will not do that when it does not fit into their view of proper sexual politics or what humanity should be. So often here, I ask myself, why are people doing this? Why do we have this view? Why does compulsory sexuality exist? And people ask me a lot, why does compulsory sexuality exist? And I don't have a very bulletproof answer for that. But I think one rhetorical or one metaphorical reason that this happens is because people allied the difference between asexuality and desexualization. And there's a lot of overlap. Like, you can be asexual and desexualized, you can be desexualized but not be asexual, so on and so forth. But one is something that you are, the other is something that has been done to you, often because of structures of violence and oppression. And people really, even people who are progressive, ally the difference and think they're the same thing. And as long as we are not careful in the language that we use and the concepts that map to those languages, as long as we see one thing only as a side effect of another thing, then I think the ways we talk about sexual politics and the future of sexual politics is definitely going to be incomplete. So I wanted to start at that because I think that it is the beginning point, until ACEs are believed for their experience, then asexuality does not exist in itself, but is only a symptom and a side effect. In fact, I heard secondhand, I'm a journalist, I have to say it secondhand, I wasn't there. But I heard secondhand a story of a junior scholar, this must have been at least 10 years ago, but a junior scholar telling a well-known queer theorist. They were studying the possibilities of asexuality within queer theory. And this theorist said dismissively that queering asexuality is like queering furniture. There's nothing there to queer. So I don't believe this is how queer theorists think about asexuality today or ace studies, but it also wasn't 100 years ago that this was something that was seen as appropriate and natural to say. And I'm actually just gossiping now, but I had some friends who were at the American Sociological Association, and they were telling me about some pretty prominent sociologists who were questioning asexuality and making just the 101 mistakes of, speculating whether ace people masturbate, and would that be, and could you ask them that? And that's shocking to me. Like, I'm not going to name names because this is being recorded, but the point is, on the one hand, the example I gave about querying furniture is from a while ago. On the other hand, the ASA was, 3 weeks ago. So keep that in mind. Anyway, so since I published my book, people have asked over and over again, how they can learn more about asexuality, what more is there to know? There's demand. So the question becomes, once ACEs have at least some form of epistemic authority, how do we build ACE studies? What are its borders and disciplines, and what does it look like? Who contributes, and what is its goal? Obviously, there's many answers. I'm just one person. This is not even my day job. But this is my answer based on the interviews I've done, the people I've spoken to. First thing I want to say is that ACE studies as a discipline cannot consist of only of people in the ivory tower. I just said the thing about the ASA, but also so much of ACE knowledge has been produced by people outside, and when it is within the ivory tower, it absolutely must be interdisciplinary. The second thing I want to say is that the goal of ACE studies, to my mind, falls roughly into 3 buckets. The first bucket is what I call ACE affirmation. So this is kind of the stuff that will come to mind the most easily when you think about what ACE studies should be. So let's think, culturally competent, therapists who know about asexuality and are not saying the things that the sex therapist said to Jesse. More representation, more demedicalization of sex and sexuality. A lot of the stuff that I touch about in my books, and things that have this really direct, real life connection between the idea, the identity, and the actual experiences of ACEs. In the time since my book has been published, I've talked to a lot of social workers, actually, and therapists, and they all say, I want to help, but I'm not really sure. I'm well-meaning, but should I just generalize what I know about trauma-informed, social worker therapy to the ACE population? Can I generalize what I know about LGBT and queer and poly-informed therapy to the population? Or how do I find more specific resources? So this bucket of ACE affirmation, I think, again, kind of the most obvious one, is the one that would fit here. How do we make ACE life better? So the second bucket is what I call ACE experience. And I think that's a little bit more abstract because it doesn't necessarily have a takeaway or kind of a news you can use or a specific tool. And if you were at the event at the bookstore earlier, you heard me talk about this. Right now, so much of ACE experience is focused on a certain type of ACE, usually young, often white, often female. And also it is focused on sex. What do ACEs think about sex? What do ACEs think about masturbation, et cetera, et cetera? So for me, ACE experience, the work that would fall under that, means chronicling ACE inner life and ACE outer life, both for a broader range of ACEs, but also specifically on issues that are not related to how we think about sex. And it's kind of, for me, being ACE has affected many parts of my life. It's affected the language that I use. It's affected the housing choices I've made. And I know more and more there are people doing research on this. But I would like to see more of that, not because it would directly necessarily benefit people, but because I think it provides these views of other ways to live, other ways to relate that are worth chronicling and that are worth understanding. So for example, because I'm in touch with a number of people who do various kinds of ACE studies, I know someone who is presenting research fairly soon about ACE approaches to housing. And that's not ACE approaches to sex, it's about ACE approaches to community and ACE approaches to literally where you live and how that affects you and what are the structural issues that might keep you from your ideal queer commune fantasy. I know a different researcher who does work on the concept of singles, which includes a lot of people who are ace and aromantic, but doesn't necessarily. And when I talk to her, she talks about these fascinating ideas at the level of language. She'll say things like, people will say to me, the word single doesn't even make sense to them because it kind of implies that it's temporally, you're single until you're not single. Like they'll say the word like self-partnered makes more sense to me, or the word sovereign makes more sense to me. And I think that's fascinating too. In the same way that I've talked to some aces and they'll say words like virgin or words like celibate don't apply to them either. So, there's not necessarily kind of a takeaway to understanding the ways that our minds work and the ways that we see the world differently, but I think there's a richness there that deserves study as much, and frankly at this point more, than the questions about attitudes, about sexuality and sex in culture. And then I think, and I think I wanted to add, it's just, sexual relationships and romantic relationships are such an organizing principle of society. So if we want to change that, why not think about the people who are already thinking about it differently and relating differently? So you may have noticed that these buckets kind of run into each other. And this runs directly into my third point, which is about ace possibility. I was saying this earlier again at the bookstore, but one of the things that I do regret from writing my book is that I think I focused a lot on the ways in which it is difficult to be ace, and the ways in which, and of course this is true, structurally it is hard to be in a world that is not built for you and that prevents you from accessing the language and the words and the community to then understand yourself and find the community. And I think that's fine, but I think more and more we need to focus on what does it look like to go ahead. And all of these build on each other, right? Because if you don't have the affirmation that helps aces find each other and understand each other, then it's harder for them to see the possibility and kind of how do they relate. And it's even harder for them to go from, okay, I want things that may be different, or maybe I want the same things, but I want to get them in a different way, and to make that a reality. So the two examples that I often use, I have a friend who's ace, not a romantic, and she wants a partner. She hasn't found one yet, and I think she's on the path to being a single parent. And she said that if she weren't ace, maybe that's not something that she would pursue. She knows she deeply, deeply wants to have a child, but she said, maybe if I weren't ace, I would think, that's so different, that's so difficult, how can I do that? And of course, being a single parent is different and difficult, but I think for her being ace, she's already structured her life in many ways that are different from the ways others. Why not do this as well? Or another example that I really love to talk about, because it's very local to me, is that my friend who lives in the same neighborhood as I do in Brooklyn, and who is ace, got together a bunch of people and created an LLC, and they bought two houses next to each other, these Victorian houses in Ditmas Park in Brooklyn, and they're literally just queer communes. And I think that's so, it's not just we're going to talk about this queer fantasy commune, but we're going to do it because we've made it this far and we are comfortable with ourselves and we want to be in community with other queer folks. So those are kind of examples of queer and ace specifically possibility, much of it around relationships, much of it around housing. If you read the book, you know that the very last chapter is about co-parenting, and David, who is ace, co-parenting. I see more and more ace folks are becoming interested in that and thinking about what would it mean to parent, to raise children, to build a family outside of two parents and they live in their own place. So these are the three buckets. To focus on the possibilities means taking the experience and then pushing toward and investigating the ways that these experiences can remake the world. I wrote in the book that aces are forced to be creative because the world doesn't cater to us. But I think I would like to go 3 years on, one step further, and say, the world doesn't cater to a lot of people, but that doesn't mean that you can't go ahead and try and make it cater to you. Cater is maybe the wrong word, but I think you know what I mean. So the third thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the asexuality today and where does it fit into the culture. And someone asked a really good question about this earlier, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot ever since my book was published. So the book came out in 2020, but I sold the book in 2017, and that was the same month that the Harvey Weinstein allegations came out, which I remember because I think I was trying to write an essay about asexuality at the time, and my editor was bringing up the Me Too allegations. I don't remember what the conversation was, but it's something to do with are these in tension? Which absolutely not, but let's set that aside. And what I mean is that in the past 5 years, and particularly in the past 2 to 3 years or so, the conversation about asexuality and the conversation about sex in our society has changed. I feel it as someone who lives in the world. I feel it particularly as someone who lives in who works in the media and has to read these think pieces all the time, even if I don't want to. And I hear it in the conversations that I have with my friends, and I hear it in the ways that people are talking about sex. So since my book came out, there have been multiple books with titles like The Case Against the Sexual Revolution or Rethinking Sex. I hear the trad wife is like an archetype that I hear a lot about, and I'm afraid to go in that area of TikTok, so I may never see it for myself, but I know that it exists. There have been more and more trend pieces about, did the sexual revolution fail us? Especially, did it fail women? Was it wrong? Did it create a hookup culture that was ultimately unsustainable? And I think that on the surface, this is a change from kind of the Sex and the City, early 2000s era. I think that what happened sociologically is that after Tinder, sorry to blame it all on Tinder, but I do kind of blame it all on the factors that led to Tinder. After Tinder came out in 2011 and the rise of dating apps, the ways we thought about dating and other people and sex and consent started to change. And now I think we're at a point where, at least if I talk to my own friends, which of course is a bubble, I don't think anyone is happy with the state of sexual politics in America. I don't think anyone is happy with dating and how you meet people and how you get to know people. And that unhappiness has led to this strain of thought that, on the surface, I think seems kind of ace-friendly. On the surface, it's, maybe we shouldn't center sex so much in all kinds of relationships. Maybe there's other forms of relationships we could have. Maybe hookup culture has its costs, even as it has benefits too. But I feel very conflicted about this, even as the ideas may seem to be running in parallel. One is because I don't want ace stuff to be left behind as the zeitgeist is changing and as the current is changing. First, when I was writing the book, I kind of felt like to most people ace stuff was just trivia. It was something interesting, but it didn't apply to you. And now, as these ideas are changing, I sometimes feel like ace ideas are not being properly acknowledged or properly cited, which is not to say that aces are the only folks who've thought about this, but if we talk about intellectual history and who gets credit for what, I don't want aces to be invisible in this kind of sphere of public knowledge production. So that's one reason. But the other reason is because I think that the kind of right-wing trad, all of the anti-sexual revolution stuff is ultimately regressive, and it ultimately is about, oh, we were wrong to have the sexual revolution, let's go back to that. Whereas I think ace thought is a lot more about, okay, we were right with the sexual revolution, we maybe overcorrected a little bit, and we shouldn't have just flipped the circle. It's about the synthesis of various ideas leading to more ideas for everyone else, not just saying A was wrong, let's go back to B. So one thing I think about a lot is that we talk about asexuality as an identity category, we talk about asexuality as a label and a way to understand yourself. I really think about asexuality myself as a lens. I really think about it as a philosophy, and I think that the philosophy is not necessarily about what is sexual attraction or what is romantic attraction, but the philosophy is about having the courage and the self-trust and the epistemic authority to even discover what may be right for you, and to then have the confidence in yourself that it is right for you when other people say that it is not. Because I think other people, maybe this is cynical, but I think other people will always misunderstand. And so the ace lens is providing the scaffolding and all of those emotional, intellectual tools to see the other possibilities and build a life on your own terms. Sometimes the conversations we have around various forms of sex and sexuality really remind me of the film The Lobster, the Yorgos Lanthimos film, which is pretty long, came out pretty long, so I mean, I don't feel bad if there's spoilers, but essentially, at the beginning of the film, you are punished if you don't have a partner, and then the protagonist is miserable, and then he does find a partner, and he's punished for not having a partner, you know. And in both those situations, he doesn't have freedom. And similarly here, we want these grand, totalizing guidelines, you know. So we're always saying, you know, is choking during sex, is that, you know, consensual and fun, or is it something that people are pressured into? Is it something that spices things up in the bedroom? Is it something that's degrading to whoever is, you know, is being choked? Like, these are the types of questions that we ask. Or, you know, polyamory, is it inherently liberated, or is it coercive in a way to justify coercive behaviors in various communities? And it's just never one or the other. I think the way we've talked about these things has been so polarized, and we need to be thinking, what is right for me? Because for one person, to use a choking example, it can be coercive. For another person, it can be pleasurable. And for the same person, it can be both things at the same time or at different times with different experiences. So I think Ace Thought, which to me is really about questioning all of these relationships, is about giving us that extra nudge. We've already questioned compulsory sexuality, we've questioned amatonormativity. What else can we question on the level of the societal, but also on the level of the more personal? And so what I think this all comes back to, you know, this theme of what is the future of ace politics. I always say I don't think sexual liberation is possible without the ace perspective and without the aros perspective and without, you know, the trans perspective and the disabled perspective. All of that is bound together. I do think that we are at an interesting inflection point where ideas are coming from many different places, where I see and hear and feel a lot more movement than in all the time before I started writing the book. Times in which I was still thinking about these. And I think it's this time for us to be pushing forward and being respectful of ourselves and respectful of all the people who are in good faith trying to figure things out for themselves and for society. And it is a really exciting time, I think, to be engaged in this work and to be finding our own paths to freedom. Thank you. So I've been a journalist my entire career before I identified as ace, and I knew how the publishing industry worked. So I think for me, it was really this combination of, it felt like something that someone should write about, and a series of ideas that helped me, and it felt like something that I could do because I was a reporter and I knew how the industry worked. And so those were the things. It was less a particular event that made me say, the world needs this book, and more, I'm tired of having the same conversation with my friends all the time where I'm kind of doing the ACE 101 thing. What if a book could do that? What if I could do that? So it was more like that. Other ideas? Yes?
Thank you. This was awesome. I teach management and organizing here in our business school. This piece about kind of learning new ways of thinking about organizing and living through people who are on the progressive edge of expressing and finding themselves. Are you experiencing new ways of organizing commerce, business, cooperatives in Brooklyn that are related to sexuality expression?
That's a good question. I am not, off the top of my head, so first of all, I'm sure it's happening. Off the top of my head, I don't know if commerce is, if that's the exact thing that's happening. And I think the reasons for that, one is that many people who know that they're ace and are self-identify as ace are on the younger side, so we don't have a lot of access to capital, frankly. Like, I do not have the access to capital to be investing in these. And also, as you know, it can be very complicated. But, I mean, this is not commerce, but I know there are people who are working on issues around housing, around family law. I'm pretty sure there's probably a DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization, the Web3 stuff. I know that there have been attempts to have like queer organizations work with Web3 and blockchain. So those are things that come to mind, but I don't have one particularly good example.
Oh, that's great. And is it okay to do a follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
Make sure I heard this right. A really good allied behavior, capital support to someone's ideas.
Yes, I think in general, capital support to behavior is always good, but yes, I think so.
Thanks.
Yeah. Others?
I actually have a question.
Yes.
So this is probably ACE 101, and I'm sorry for kind of going back a little bit. I really appreciate this idea of affirmation and moving forward and the future of ACE politics. But just maybe going back to the heart of question about what ACE actually is, and maybe it sounds like a simple question, but maybe it's more complicated. As you're saying, there isn't always a concrete takeaway, and it's the richness of the experience that we need to investigate and embrace. But it's just, and maybe some people in the audience might, this might resonate with some folks. So I'm just gonna speak a little personal experience. I was in a really bad marriage a few years ago, and there was a lot of emotional and sexual trauma that I experienced. And during that time, I just lost like every desire for any kind of sexual relationship. But I didn't have the language or any kind of reference to acknowledge my experience or understand what was going on. And I started reading up about asexuality, and I thought, okay, so I must be asexual. And I was very comfortable in that space. And then, I was very comfortable in that space. However, recently I've been in a relationship. I know you've talked about this earlier as well. And I've been in a relationship, so when I was going through that experience, I ended up writing an article which got published, and like a lot of people read it. And all of a sudden, the next thing I know, I'm being invited to panels about sexuality and sexual identities and ACE and asexuality. And I refrained from all of those, not because I was reticent to talk about it, but I felt like dishonest because I wasn't exactly sure what I was experiencing was an ACE experience, which also goes back to one of your points about one of the buckets being about the experience. But recently, I've been in a relationship, a fulfilling relationship, and I feel is it fair to say that the ACE orientation can be impermanent? Can someone maybe, if it's a philosophy and a way of understanding the world, can you still be in a sexually active relationship but still embody certain ACE philosophies? Like how would people navigate across those two things?
Yeah, so
ACE and allo, let's say.
Yeah, so to take your first question, like what is ACE? People always ask, and then I think whatever answer I give is always dissatisfactory. Because, people now say we should say asexualities instead of asexuality because it's so broad. And, the most common definition, which I'm sure you saw in the book, is, doesn't experience or experiences very little sexual attraction. But I think there's so many ways in which one's relationship to sexual attraction or sexual desire or just sex can be different, and all of them can fall under the ACE umbrella. So the more, I've been talking with folks, people talk about, updating that definition to not focus so heavily on you never experience it, or or focus so heavily on attraction as opposed to other things, because they all blend together. So I think that, again, it actually, I think, probably makes things more complicated. But people always say, is it a useful idea for you? Is it a useful thing? And I also think ACE experience and ACE identity can be slightly different things. I do think asexuality can be fluid, just like I think many types of sexual expression can be fluid and can change over time. So I don't see why asexuality would be an exception to that. But I think, the question people will have is, I thought I was ACE, maybe now I don't think that I'm ACE. Was I wrong about that? Was I lying? Was it dishonest? And what I tend to say, and we talked about this a little bit, so I said this a little earlier, is that I think you had an ACE experience, and that was your understanding of it at the time, and with the frameworks available to you, I don't think it was dishonest, even if your experience now is different. And I think even people who don't necessarily identify as ACE, as their kind of persistent sounds like a disease, as their main orientation, I think people can go in and out of ACE-ness. And so, yeah, I've actually talked to a lot of people who have that question of, oh, I was so involved in the ACE community, and then something changed, and then for me, and I became ashamed, and was I lying? Most of the time, I don't think we're lying to. I don't think we're lying to ourselves. I think we just change, and it's not that there's something deep down that we're hiding, because there's so much shame when you think that you think that you had it, and then you didn't have it. But I don't think that needs to be there.
Other questions?
Yes.
So, personally for me, recently I've been very turned off of sex because of the amount of sexualized characters in media or advertising, and I want to get your thoughts on sex in advertising and how that might turn somebody off of wanting to be intimate.
I think sex in advertising has always been there, and I think it's gotten worse and worse over time. I think it has become more sexualized. I think it is one thing that if you start looking at it all around, you're not the only person I've heard say this. At a certain point, you start to feel like you're being manipulated on this very base level in which people, first of all, they sell something to you, right? So they're thinking about you as a mass, and they're like, what is going to get their attention? It's this thing that is maybe sometimes not under their control. So when I've heard people say similar things, it's been with that kind of rhetoric. Like, I feel manipulated. I feel like they're trying to use some part of me. I'm not going to give in to that. So all to say, I think that's common. I don't know if understanding that will make things change, because I don't, who controls the advertising industry? It's certainly not me. But I understand the impulse. I also feel it too. Whenever I think I'm being manipulated, I get really angry and rebel. But at a certain point, I think the question is, it's like a reverse psychology thing, right? Like, if you're going against something because you think they're manipulating you, aren't you still giving them some power over whatever your experience is? Which isn't to say that it's wrong, but I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about, regardless of what other people want from me, whether it's to buy something or something else, what is it that I want? I try not to think about myself as giving in to this or not giving into that. I think about, what do I want? And sometimes it aligns with what other people want from me, and sometimes it doesn't align with what other people want from me. Yes.
One of the really moving parts, I think, about what you're saying has to do with the inclusiveness. You're embracing so many different categories under asexuality. I think about other words that use a, away from, that are so contentious and exclusive. Things like, atheists that spark all kinds of, nasty arguments among people. And I've been thinking about the ways you're talking about living too. I wonder, since our students here spend a lot of time theorizing about binaries and ways in which to get in the middle and explode binaries so that we're not on an either or a one and other spectrum with each other. Could you talk a little more about other ways in which this philosophy is inclusive, housing? Could you expand on that topic?
Yeah, so housing is, as I just mentioned, one. I think different types of family law is another one, remaking what family looks like. I think on the level of not necessarily law and policy, but just making queer platonic relationships and making commitments to people that are not traditional romantic commitments. But I also think a lot about the ways in which we do conceptualize of sexuality or sexualities, because we have, as being gay, et cetera, and then we have gender, and all of them, it's better to have a spectrum than it is to have, you're straight or you're gay or so on. But a spectrum, I keep using this metaphor of constellations. It's just something I've been playing around with, is that why does it have to be two-dimensional? Spectrum's like pretty two-dimensional, right? Why can't it be three-dimensional? Why can't we think about it in a different way, where you have your gender and your sexuality and they connect, because they're often very connected. You know, people's genders and sexualities are often mediated by each other, and then you have race or you have ability, and they all connect to create like a shape, instead of here's 5 spectrums and I'm gonna like put my star sticker on each of those. So when I think about these things, I really, you know, obviously language is important to me. I spend a lot of time thinking about language. And I also should say I have a terrible visual memory. Like, I cannot rotate a shape in my mind to save my life. But I do wonder, you know, we are very boxed in by even the idea of a spectrum, even the idea of a binary. Is there a way we can apply more visual thinking, more three-dimensional thinking to the concepts that we're using, and then, I don't know, backfill with language? So that's something I've thought about a lot. In part because sometimes I'll see sex ed, usually teens or younger, and they'll still show spectrums, they'll show the Kinsey scale. And it just gets to me that visually we are not as sophisticated as we could be. Other questions? You can really ask me anything. I know it's kind of a weird vibe because I'm like sitting up here, but you can ask me about writing or about, yes.
Movement and asexuality. I know that a lot of people who are neurodiverse are often desexualized, and so that can prevent them from identifying with the label of asexual. And I also know that like a lot of people who are neurodiverse experience their asexuality and or aromanticism as connected to their neurodiversity. So I'm just curious, like, what kinds of experiences you've heard from people, and you know, what your thoughts are in that area.
Yeah, I think this actually ties into my previous point. So I've heard both of those kinds of experiences. I've heard the one where it's like, I don't want to identify as ace because people are already desexualizing me, which is a thing that a lot of people think, not just folks who are neurodiverse. I've also seen, you know, people desexualize me, but I'm not ace, and so on and so forth. And I think this has to do with our conceptualization of, you know, you have your sexuality, then you have whether you're neurodiverse or not, then you have your gender, and why can't they be connected? Like, I think there is a desire for things to be really cleanly separated out, so one thing never affects the other. But in my experience, almost every part of my life affects every part of my life. So why would it be wrong for you to experience your neurodivergence as part of your asexuality, or your asexuality as part of your neurodivergence? Again, to kind of use this metaphor of a more three-dimensional idea of identity instead of like the checklists or the spectrums, like you can imagine. I'm gonna make this up because I don't really know how this kind of software works, but it's like you can imagine like some things are weighted more heavily, because for me, sometimes being ace is not very, you know, relevant to my life, and it doesn't feel very present. At other times it does feel more present. Sometimes gender feels more present, other times gender doesn't feel more present. And you can imagine kind of this model where things have different weights, things are connected in different ways, because it's all very fluid. And I feel like we're always trying to kind of reconcile these things. We're working with this model of identity that's quite discrete, and you think of it as not changing over time. You're like, I'm gonna figure this out once and for all. Am I actually ace, or is that just is that tied into my neurodiversity? But what if it's actually all connected together, and it's because of the way that we think about it and talk about it that we've been trained to, you know, have to find the clear boundaries.
I have a question about
Yes.
ace and race. So in your book, you talk about a 2016 survey where I think you said 83% of the respondents who said they were ace were white. So the ace community seems like it's very white community. Can you speak about that, how race interacts with sexuality or the ace movement in particular in this country? Is it partly because people of color are less likely to be open and recognized for their queerness? Could that be a factor?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. I also think that, Depending, I mean, I think that being a racial minority means that oftentimes your sexuality has been controlled. And, so there's a long history of, for example, women of color being sterilized, or, there's kind of a long eugenic history. And so when you know that history of your people, and you've been desexualized, often in very violent ways, I think it can be difficult to claim asexuality. And it can also be difficult to know how much of it, once again, going to this question, how much of it is actually my feelings about my race or my, ongoing relationship with race, and how much of it is true asexuality. There's such a desire to find the true asexuality that doesn't change and will give you, so you will know what is truly you, and race adds another layer to that. And I will also say, and this is not something I wrote about in the book, but something that I thought about more and more, is that also not just race, but being an immigrant can also be hard, because I think I've talked to a lot of immigrants, I'm an immigrant, and they'll say things like, oh, my friends who are people of color, will understand that I'm ace, but my parents will say things like, that's a white thing, that's an American thing, we don't have asexuality in India, or we don't have asexuality in Nigeria. And so that also, when you already have complicated feelings about assimilation, to be part of a community that can feel like assimilation, I think that can be a tall ask.
Time-wise, we got a few more questions. Time for a couple more.
I have one about kind of this multi-factored piece about expression and context. That's kind of what I heard. And, the idea that this has been my impression of your comments, when forced to think about it, the language kind of binds you to this maybe cross-sectional reference point, right? In this present moment when somebody's asking me about something, I'm now going to express a particular point of view. But in other contexts, other times, that's less present. When is if you feel comfortable sharing, the asexual expression, or asexuality expression, less of a feature day to day?
Mm-hmm.
And then when does it level up? I mean, I gather here, first and foremost,
Mm-hmm.
right? When is it lesser, I guess?
Well, I work as a journalist. I'm an editor at Wired, so I can't say that my day-to-day job has a lot to do with ace stuff. So in a lot of professional contexts, it doesn't necessarily come up just day to day. Of course, Condé Nast, like most corporations, has pride stuff and queer groups and such. But in those situations, if I'm going to a restaurant, I really don't think about it. But yeah, I think it comes up when it comes up relationally. And when I say relationally, I mean personal relationships. It does not really come up in my professional relationships with my boss. But when I think about the choices I make with my partner, or the choices that I make thinking about my family, like my family of origin, or I think about my friendships, I think then it's a lot more present. But yeah, I think it is more present in, I don't want to say private life, because so much of that is public, but personal life. I think it comes up less in my professional life, this excluded.
So what would be your advice or your sentiment about, should it feature more in the professional venue, right? Is the organization, maybe I don't think I'm putting you on the spot with Wired or Condé Nast more broadly, but it's what's the right way to meet you professionally such that you are honored in this sense, but it's also not a token or weird or what have you, right?
I think for me, first of all, give me a raise is the first one, if anyone from Condé Nast is in the audience. But I think for me, I feel like the level of engagement I get in the workplace is fine for me personally. What I'm actually more interested in is, if other people on staff are ace, and some of my colleagues, they're not ace, but they've talked to me about my book, that they feel like they can talk to me about things that aren't quite within the purview of the magazine we're putting out. So it's important for me to kind of build that culture where I don't want to be talking about ace stuff at work. I want to be meeting my deadlines, but that they know that is something that people can talk about, because it can affect just many parts of their life. But I don't need Condé to do some kind of weird ace day thing, because I don't love that from corporations. So
There's some bucket that's right, and then there's a line that that would be crossed where it would be strange at the very least, if not maybe even gradient into harmful.
Yeah, but I think that I'm just one person, and I think for many people the line for what, because I know there are plenty of people who would want more engagement from their workplace than maybe I would.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about kind of how compulsory sexuality and compulsory partnership sort of overlaps? Because you talked about the experience of people you interviewed who didn't really identify with the term singles because that's really not how they see themselves or how they are building their lives. But it kind of seems that there would be a lot of overlap in terms of people conflate partnership with sexuality and vice versa. And how does that kind of resonate with you and your experience?
Yeah, so first thing, I just want to say that that wasn't my research, that was someone else's research. I would not want to take away from, I would not want to have false glory. I do think people conflate it, and I think you see it when, one of the biggest misconceptions about asexuality was that it also meant you were aromantic, right? And nowadays, I think it is also still fairly uncommon to talk about people who are aromantic and not asexual. They are different things. Sexual attraction, romantic attraction, they're separate, but they're so often conflated. So I'm going to say something that I shouldn't because the episode's not out yet, but This American Life is doing an episode, the radio show, is doing an episode on someone who's aromantic but not asexual, and I was brought in to kind of give them some notes on things like that. And it was really interesting to talk to the hosts and hear, it was very hard for them to wrap their minds around not necessarily aromanticism. I think if you kind of explain the basic understanding of aromanticism, most people will understand pretty quickly. But I think there were all these questions about there are some aromantic people who do want relationships. And they're like, what does that mean? I thought being aromantic meant you didn't want a relationship. Or there are these questions like, can aromantic people have relationships? And even if it's, if it looks romantic, is it romantic? So, I don't blame the hosts for going down that rabbit hole because I think these are questions that all of us are still thinking about and answering. It's not like there's a WikiHow page that answers those things, but the more I think about the parts of the community that are less represented, and I want to be careful, I'm not aromantic, that's why when I was brought in for this, I brought in someone else who was aromantic, so I want to be careful about not speaking out of turn. But when you think, asexuality within the A spectrum has received the most attention, probably in part because of my book. And I think that's good, but I don't want aromanticism as its own separate thing, not always connected to asexuality. I think that needs to receive more attention because there's so many fascinating questions there. What does it mean if you're aromantic but want a romantic relationship? If you are already in a romantic relationship and you discover that you're aromantic, what does that mean for you and your partner? And what are the expectations we put on ourselves? What are the emotional expectations we have for our partners? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. There's overlap and there's also not overlap. And I think there's a richness that hasn't been explored yet.
I think we have time for one more question. May I?
Yes, please.
Because I made notes, So in your book, you quote this journalist Rachel Hill, I think her name is, who talks about the sex myth. So this is sort of piggybacking on Ben's question about the intersection between sexuality and media. So on the one hand, you have compulsory sexuality was entrenched in the media and pop culture. But on the other hand, studies have shown, I think, that younger people are having less sex than previous generations. So where's that gap coming from?
I think there's a lot of things that come from that gap. I think, first of all, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think so often those headlines are like, oh no, because you can imagine maybe one reason people are having less sex is because there's less coerced sex, because you feel more comfortable saying no, and you're not in these situations where maybe it's technically consensual, but it's unwanted. So that's the first thing I would say is that, the headlines and the framing is often very negative. But I do think that why are people having less sex? I think people are a lot more anxious than they used to be. I'm not really a sociologist, but when I talk to people who are sociologists, people talk about how Like, I'm just gonna blame Tinder again, or the internet, or the pandemic made it hard to meet people. So I think there's a lot of very broad societal trends that have led to that are not necessarily connected directly to like the sexualization or the sex in advertising. But don't quote me on that because I'm definitely not a sociologist.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.